The settlement of New Caris had one unbreakable rule: never approach the Shadow Maw dens after dark. Lyra Dent had broken that rule 3 months ago, and somehow she was still alive. She stood now at the mouth of Thorne's cave, boots planted on cold stone, slick with condensation. Her breathing controlled despite the cold sweat running down her spine. The air smelled of iron, wet rock, and the musky scent of Shadow Maw fur. Behind her, 4 Shadow Maw cubs huddled together, each the size of a large wolf. Their fur was midnight black, so dark it seemed to drink in the light, broken only by bioluminescent stripes that pulsed slowly along their flanks, soft greens and faint blues like distant nebulae. They chirped and trilled anxiously, crowding against one another and against Lyra's legs, trying to shrink deeper into the cave. Before her, 5 Krelllic hunters stood in a semicircle, plasma rifles aimed steadily at her chest. "Step aside, human," the lead hunter hissed. His voice had a rasp to it, like sand over stone. His forked, reptilian tongue flickered between teeth that were more like serrated blades than anything organic. Had a right to be. His scales shimmered with an oily sheen in the cave's low light, a mottled pattern of dark bronze and sickly green. "The cubs fetch high prices in the outer rim markets," he went on. "You need not die for beasts." Lyra's hands were empty. Her sidearm was half a kilometer away at the research station, locked away as per the treaty between New Caris and the non-human species on this world. No weapons in the field, no exceptions. All she had was her body, her voice, and the reckless conviction that had led her into xenobiology in the first place. "No," she said simply. The Krelllic leader's vertical pupils narrowed. "You are unarmed. We are 5. This is foolish, even by human standards." "Probably," Lyra admitted. She shifted her stance almost imperceptibly, lowering her center of gravity, angling her shoulders. She'd spent weeks studying Shadow Maw body language, how they moved, how they hunted, how they fought. She wasn't one of them, couldn't ever be, but she understood them enough to borrow, and she had made a promise. Her mind flickered back, unbidden, to the day it had all begun. 3 months earlier, she'd been alone on a sampling run near this very den, collecting moss and lichen and soil microbes, filling vials and muttering field notes into her recorder. Her attention had been on her work, not on the unstable cliff face above. She hadn't noticed the subtle rattling of loose stone until it was too late. The rock slide had come down like an avalanche of knives. She'd woken half buried in rubble, her legs screaming with each breath. The entrance to the den had become a jagged crack in the rock, barely wide enough for light to seep through. Every movement sent shards of pain lancing up her side. She'd expected to die there either from her injuries or from Thorne himself, when he returned to find a human intruder in his home. Instead, the Alpha Shadow Maw had done something no one in New Caris would have believed. He had watched. For 2 days, he'd stood in the shadows, a colossal silhouette at the back of the cave, bioluminescent stripes barely glowing. Lyra had felt his eyes on her while she used her field kit to set her fractured leg, while she injected herself with painkillers and antibiotics, while she crawled inch by agonizing inch to a safer spot. Every instinct had screamed at her to look away, to avoid eye contact, to make herself small and non-threatening. She'd done none of those things. Instead, she'd talked, not in his language, not really, but in her own soft, steady, explaining what she was doing, narrating her actions. She kept her hands visible, made movements slow and deliberate. She mimicked what she'd read in old xenobiology reports about predator social cues. When he rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound like distant thunder, she answered with a quiet voice and a bowed head. On the third day, Thorne had moved. He had padded forward on massive paws, each step shaking dust from the ceiling. Lyra had tried not to flinch as he lowered his head, his breath hot and damp against her face. He could have torn her apart in a heartbeat. Instead, he opened his jaws and gently laid something on the stone beside her hand. Water. He'd carried it in his mouth from the underground stream that ran beneath the den, careful not to spill it. It had pooled in a hollow in the rock, just enough for her to drink. An understanding had begun there, fragile, improbable, but real. Over the following weeks, Lyra had watched his pack. She'd learned their language of growls and head tilts and subtle shifts of weight. She'd seen how they greeted each other with brief forehead touches, how they circled the cubs protectively, how they shared food. She'd recorded it all in her field notes, her scientist's mind cataloging what her heart was already recognizing. They weren't monsters. They were family animals, pack animals, capable of loyalty and grief and tenderness. When Thorne's mate had died giving birth to their litter, Lyra hadn't left. She'd stayed, legs still healing, and helped as best she could. She'd fed the cubs with nutrient mush, coaxing their tiny jaws open when they were too weak to eat. She'd cleaned their fur, chased them clumsily round the den, laughed when they tried to pounce on her boots. Every night for 3 months, even after her leg had mended enough for her to limp back to the station, she had returned to this den. She'd brought food and medical supplies. She'd taught the cubs to recognize her voice, to respond to hand signals, to practice silent stalks and sudden bursts of speed. They'd grown fast, all teeth and claws and glowing stripes. But they still shoved their huge heads into her chest for comfort when thunder rolled overhead. She'd earned a place among them, however tenuous. A strange, furless aunt. The Krelllic hunters wouldn't understand that. To them, Shadow Maw cubs were merchandise, combat beasts to be raised, conditioned, sold, and resold across the outer rim. Last chance, human, the leader said now. Step aside. Lyra inhaled slowly. The cave air was cold and sharp in her lungs. Instead of stepping aside, she dropped into a crouch, mimicking the pre-attack stance she'd seen Thorne use 100 times. Weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Shoulders low, head slightly tilted down, eyes locked on the leader. The hunter's laughter harsh, rattling sound that echoed off the stone. The first one rushed her, confident. To him, she was prey, soft, slow, fragile. Lyra waited until the last possible second, tracking his trajectory, judging his momentum. Then she dove sideways, letting his own speed carry him past her. As he stumbled, she drove her elbow up and back with everything she had. slamming it into his throat. Not hard enough to kill, Krelllic had reinforced tracheas, dense cartilage protecting their windpipes, but enough to make him choke and stagger. The second hunter fired, but Lyra had already moved, twisting so that the first hunter's body was between her and the shot. The plasma bolt hit him in the shoulder, burning through armor and flesh. He screamed, a high, tearing sound. 2 seconds, she thought. That's all I bought. Behind her, the cubs whimpered, an overlapping chorus of frightened chirps. She could hear their claws scrabbling on stone as they tried to retreat deeper into the cave, just as she drilled them to do at the first sign of danger. Good, she whispered under her breath. Smart cubs. Their father would be proud. The remaining 4 hunters spread out, moving with the smooth, practiced precision of professionals. They began to circle her, rifles raised, trying to cut off any escape path. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. Her back throbbed with each breath. Her training was in xenobiology, ecosystems, behavior patterns, lab protocols, not in combat tactics. Every move she'd made so far had been a clumsy translation of Shadow Maw techniques to a human body. Instinct and desperation held together with a thin veneer of science. Impressive, the leader conceded, slitted eyes fixed on her. But futile. He was right, and they both knew it. She was one human with minimal self-defense training, facing 4 heavily armed hunters. The math was ugly, but humans, she reflected, had never been particularly good at math when any children were involved. She charged. The hunters hadn't expected that. In their experience, prey ran away, not toward the guns. Lyra closed the distance to the nearest Krelllic in 3 stumbling, reckless steps. She grabbed the barrel of his rifle and wrenched it upward as he reflexively pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, plasma bolts exploding against the cave ceiling, sending shards of hot stone raining down. In the same motion, she drove her knee forward and up, not where a human's vulnerable points would be, but lower right where Krelllic anatomy placed their primary nerve cluster. She'd seen it in an anatomy scan once, filed it away without thinking. The hunter folded with a strangled hiss, armor clattering against rock as he went down. 3 left. Pain erupted across Lyra's back, bright and blinding, as a rifle but slammed into her spine. Her legs buckled. She hit the ground hard, cheek scraping stone, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. Through blurred vision, she saw scaled boots approaching, rifles lowered toward her face, glowing barrels humming softly. I'm sorry, little ones, she thought. I tried. The temperature in the cave dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The hairs along Lyra's arms rose. Even the Krelllic shivered, breath misting in sudden cold. The hunters froze, heads turning as one. Lyra, still sprawled on the ground, felt it first as a vibration through the stone beneath her palms. A deep, distant tremor, rhythmic and heavy. Something massive was moving fast. She forced her body to roll, every muscle screaming, just as a shadow filled the cave entrance. Thorne exploded into the den. The alpha Shadow Maw rose nearly 3 meters tall on his hind legs, a wall of black fur and rippling muscle. His bioluminescent stripes blazed not their usual calm green, but a violent, electric blue, every line along his shoulders and ribs crackling with furious light. His roar didn't just hit the ears. It bypassed them entirely and went straight to the primitive core of the brain, the place where ancient prey memories still lurked. It was a sound older than language, older than tools, a sound that said predator. Stones shook loose from the ceiling. Dust billowed. The Krelllic flinched, some of them taking involuntary steps back. They managed to shots. Blue-white bolts of plasma struck Thorne's shoulder and flank, scorching fur, blackening skin. He barely seemed to notice. Shadow Maws were ambush predators, built for explosive speed and overwhelming force. Against trained hunters in an enclosed space, one might have been in danger. Thorne was not just any Shadow Maw. He was an alpha who had just found strangers threatening his cubs and the strange, furless creature who had helped raise them. He hit the first hunter like a landslide. Claws designed to tear through bone and armor alike flashed in the dim light. Krelllic armor cracked. Scales split. One of the rifles flew from a limp hand and clattered across the floor, skidding to a stop near Lyra's fingers. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. By the time she managed to push herself up onto shaking arms, it was over. Blood spattered the cave walls, stark black against grey stone in the dim glow of bioluminescence. For Krelllic bodies lay twisted and broken. The fifth, the one she'd struck in the throat, had fallen earlier, bleeding out in stunned silence. Thorne stood among them, sides heaving, breath coming in deep gusts. His glowing stripes slowly faded from searing blue back to their usual soft green. Blood matted his fur in places, but as Lyra's eyes scanned him, she realized none of it was his. He turned toward her. For a heartbeat, Lyra's survival instincts screamed louder than everything else. She was the same species as the hunters who had invaded his den, hairless, two-legged, carrying the scent of metal and chemicals and settlements and treaties. In this moment of rage, would Thorne distinguish between them? The alpha lowered his massive head. Slowly, carefully, he stepped over the bodies and came to her. Lyra stayed still, muscles strung tight, palms pressed to the stone. Thorne stopped so close she could feel the heat of him, the rise and fall of his chest, the faint ozone tang of discharged plasma clinging to his fur. Then he pressed his forehead gently against hers. It was the Shadow Maw gesture of pack bond, of family. Behind him, the cubs tumbled out from their hiding spot, chirping with relief. They scrambled over the fallen hunters without a second glance, claws skittering on armor. One launched itself straight at Lyra's chest, knocking the breath out of her as it tried to climb into her lap. Another clambered over Thorne's paw, batting at his tail. Lyra started laughing. She couldn't help it. The sound came out half hysterical, half joyous, tangled with the last threads of terror winding out of her chest. Relief and fear and a wild, impossible happiness mixed together until all she could do was sit there on the cold stone floor and laugh, tears stinging her eyes. She wrapped her arms around the nearest cub, burying her face in its thick fur. Its deep, thrumming purr vibrated through her ribs. "You took your time," she told Thorne breathlessly. He made a sound somewhere between a chuff and a soft growl amusement she'd learned to recognize. He'd been hunting in the northern ranges, miles away. He must have run the entire distance when he'd sensed danger. When the cub's fear had rippled through whatever bond connected Shadow Maw pack members, as Lyra sat there surrounded by Shadow Maws, her back a flare of pain, and her hands trembling with the beginnings of adrenaline crash. She thought about the settlement's rules, about how the wider galaxy saw humans, useful but fragile, clever but weak, worth protecting, perhaps, but rarely feared. They never understood where human strength really lay. It wasn't in their bones or their muscles. It wasn't in their weapons or their technology. It was in the reckless, illogical, utterly unquantifiable things they did for family. Any family, even one with fangs and bioluminescent stripes and claws that could rend steel. Thorne shifted, curling his massive body around her and the cubs, a living barricade of fur and muscle and protective instinct. His tail draped across her legs like a weighted blanket. One of the cubs tried to chew on her boot. Another curled up against her side with a soft chirp, already falling asleep. In the warmth of the den, as dawn broke somewhere far above the stone ceiling, Lyra Dent, xenobiologist, treaty breaker, and honorary Shadow Maw finally let herself rest. The galaxy would learn eventually. Humans didn't need weapons to be dangerous. They just needed something worth protecting, thinking.